Welcome to Season 8 of Purposeful Empathy, a show that is dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from around the globe who understand the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. Today's episode is brought to you by Grand Huron International, an on-demand coaching provider for individuals and companies. Thanks so much for watching. Enjoy the show. So welcome to a new episode of Purposeful Empathy. Today I am joined by Dr. Davin Tan, who is a psychologist and founder of the Huddle Wisdom Podcast and YouTube series. The goal of Huddle Wisdom is to help you optimize your mental health and that of your children by using the power of empathy. He is based in New Zealand, and he also supports parents and teachers who help anxious and neurodiverse children optimize their mental health and master their emotions. He believes we all benefit when we connect with each other's stories. Welcome to the show, Davin.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Anita. It's great to be on here. Thanks for the invitation.
Okay, so where to start? When we do these when we prepare for these interviews, I typically ask my guests, what do you hope is the main takeaway from our conversation? And one of the things that you wrote that I really appreciated was that you think, okay, empathy is much more than a buzzword. It can really change lives. So I love that you said that. And I want to know whether or not you could share with our listeners and viewers, how you define empathy and why you think empathy is so important these days.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think empathy, when I was training, we talked a lot about this thing called empathy, but it wasn't very well defined, and it wasn't very well explained. Usually. People will talk about, the cognitive and affective components of empathy. And one would often try to, to use certain techniques or strategies to make sure that, you can understand what someone else is thinking or what someone else might be feeling. But sometimes there's still this sense of disconnection, or that you're not quite sinking in or jamming with the other person. You're not quite in the same on the same wavelength. Even though you might be practicing all these techniques and strategies that you were taught. When I say you, I mean me, in our training. And so as I started work as a psychiatrist over the last 10 or so years, I started to I suppose get a feel for what empathy might mean, but I don't have a good definition myself. So you might say it's a bit of a work in progress. So I kind of feel as though empathy also encompasses a perceptive component, this sense that you can link in with another person and feel as though you're, I use the word in clinic, jamming, we're sort of jamming, we're kind of riffing off one another, like in jazz, when people are sort of in the pocket and in sync, and you can kind of sense each other's rhythms. And I think that's kind of, and you have to correct me if I'm wrong here, because I'm sure you have lots to say about it, but I think that's when you're connected, you're empathically connected. You can kind of feel what each other is feeling, and why it changes lives is because, especially in clinic, I see lots of anxious kids, lots of kids who are depressed, adults who are depressed, who often feel misunderstood, and also some of my patients who suffer from delusions or hallucinations, psychosis. They're sort of losing touch of reality, not just external reality, but they struggle to know what's real within themselves. And so I find that being able to sink in and gel and jam with them, while being cognizant of, the cognitive, affective, and perceptual components of empathy really helps them to feel understood and validated. And then when that happens, there's this sense of trust that comes out of that, and then they feel more secure, and then they let down their guard, and then they can speak more freely, they can connect more freely, and that just makes the work in clinic much, much richer and more real. So, and then that's when, I think the work of changing lives, it's maybe a bit aspirational to say it like that, but I think that's when you can start to make some meaningful changes in someone's life when they trust you to do that with them. I don't know if that makes any sense.
I love the concept of empathy jamming. I love the concept of jamming with a patient in clinic, but I also see how useful that would be in just conversations just generally to create this kind of connection. So, we're going a bit off script here right off the bat, but I wonder if there's anything that you've learned to do, and maybe it can't be articulated. Maybe it's something that is just felt in the moment, but I wonder, are there sort of like tips that you have for how you can get into that jam faster?
Yes. So, so I've started to play around with these visual ideas. So I've got two actually. One is like a triangle, and I put those three components of I mean, there's more than three components, I'm sure, but I'm not clever enough to come up with more. But so I've got these three components of the cognitive, the affective, and then the perceptual, and they're all at the apex of the triangle, and it's a rotating triangle. And so in my mind, what I try and do with the person I'm interacting with is I try and make sure that that triangle's always moving, so that I don't lose touch of each of those corners, because I want to make sure that, I've understood what they're thinking, what they might be feeling, and this other more intangible bit of what they might be perceiving. So I always rotate the triangle to make sure that I'm checking and rechecking my understanding, that I'm appreciating and fully locked in with what they are experiencing from a cognitive, emotional, and perceptive way of thinking, feeling, and perceiving. And then the perceptive part, so this is the other bit which I'm still developing and thinking about. I've got this visual analogy of magnets. So when you have two, I can't remember if it's opposite or the same poles of magnets, they kind of repel each other. And then when you switch the poles, they attract. And we can't see what's going on, but you can definitely feel what's going on when you're sort of trying to put two poles of the magnets together and you're trying to pull them apart. I think the same thing happens between people. It's almost like this physiological shift that if you're aware of it, you can kind of harness that perception to then orientate yourself towards another person's experience. It sounds a bit esoteric, but it's like a magnet, like when you're sitting with a best friend and you feel like you're both completely attracted to one another. Yeah, there's this feeling, there's this pull. And when you're not sinking in, there's this repulsion. And I think patients feel that when they talk about feeling invalidated by their clinician or their psychiatrist, and then they feel a sense of trust when there's this magnetic pull. I don't know if that makes sense. So there's these two visual images that I like to play around in my head when I'm with patients.
Well, I love the fact that you give so much thought to that. And it sounds like you actually do a fair bit of work in order to really be present. And what I'm thinking about as I'm listening to you is what a gift it is to actually hold space for someone where they really feel your presence, and I think that when you're
Mm.
in a really empathic stance, and you're open-hearted and non-judgmental and holding a space, that it's a real gift. So that's what's coming from the conversation, what you're sharing with me. So I appreciate that right off the bat. Do
Oh,
you think that empathy is something that can be taught and learned?
yeah. I was thinking about that question when you worded it in that way, and I think it can. Obviously, some people, you use the word gift, and I think some people are maybe more naturally inclined to to be empathic, if I can use that term in that way. Um, but for those who might not be so natural at it, I think there are things that we can do to help them. And when I say them, I also mean me, because I'm still learning. But how to be more efficient or more cognizant of what they're doing. And yes, so the short answer is yes. I think it can be taught. I think it can be learned. But how we transmit that knowledge onto someone else, I think is quite difficult. So I've been trying to play around, like what we were talking about, these visual images, to see if if I can systematize some of these concepts so that I can then transfer some knowledge onto others who might want to learn how to be better at jamming or sinking in with the people that they care and love, and their patience, and like you said, anyone that you come across.
Well, I've had, conversations with other people who care deeply about empathy and practice empathy and want other people to know the benefits of empathy. And what
Mhm.
I've come to realize is how much self-awareness is part of it. Like the on-ramp to empathy has to be a sense of how you are being
Yes,
in the moment in relation to other people, right? That you can't just
yes,
be reactively kind of moving through the world, that you have to kind of have a moment of like, okay, I can choose to show up differently. I can choose to hear things differently. I can choose to respond, by taking a
yes.
breath. So I think that's a big part of it.
Yes, no, I think you're exactly right. And actually, yeah, I kicked myself that I didn't actually say that before. I think, yes, I think you're very right. Self-awareness is so much a part of learning how to be empathic, I suppose, because like you were saying before, we can't just be reactive. We have to actually be mindful enough to take in the other person's experience and then reflect, and then not only reflect but also introspect. Because like you were saying before, and I'm probably butchering what you're saying, but it's a two-way street, isn't it? It's like a 4D two-way street. Mm,
You're right. And I can't take
mm.
credit because, as I just said, I'm learning from the empathy experts that I'm interviewing how much self-awareness is part of empathy. So I guess, the thank yous go out to all the shoulders, what is it, the expression, like standing on the shoulder of giants, standing on the
Mm.
giant. Yeah, that's the expression.
Yes,
You talk about the practice of empathic discipline. What does that
yes.
mean?
Um, yeah, so so in the process of trying to systematize a way of teaching empathy to others, in particular parents and my patients and carers of patients, and teachers that I work with, I've put together, I guess, a series of principles or ideas, in a package that people can take and absorb and integrate into what they already do, so that they can then, I guess, be more empathic. And the reason why I say empathic discipline is because I believe that empathy is really important when it comes to this idea of discipline, with kids. And because I see a lot of kids, I see a lot of parents who, well-meaning and well-intentioned parents, including myself, you're just sort of tearing your hair out trying to figure out what to do with really complex situations sometimes. And more often than not, when parents, myself, when clinicians, when carers step back and learn how to be more mindful and self-aware, as you highlighted before, you can then start that process of learning how to lock in with the kid in front of you, and then truly start to understand where they're coming from. And then the act of, or the process of discipline becomes more of a collaboration. You're solving problems together. It's not that you're trying to correct, misbehavior in a child, because, we all misbehave, and we all misbehave because there's been some incompatibility between our ability to cope with certain demands and environment. And so it might manifest as misbehavior. I guess misbehavior is in the eye of the beholder. And so if we can truly lock in and empathize with the child, we can then discover the things that produce the misbehavior by really empathizing, and then we can solve whatever it was that was the problem that generated that misbehavior. And so, so that's why I called it the practice of empathic discipline. It's a set of principles that people can use to then learn how to discipline, co-create, collaborate with their child or young person in an empathic way. And
are those downloadable somewhere, or how do we get access to those?
Yes. So you can get it. It's an audio-based course, and people can get it on my website. Do you want me to say what the website is?
Or? We'll include that in the description below.
Okay. Okay. All right.
Good. Great. Yeah. Okay. So let me make this real. Let me ask if you can think of an anecdote where, there's a parent and a child together, and there's a circumstance that plays out, and what a parent can do differently to engage with more empathic discipline. Can you just bring that to like an anecdotal level?
Yes, I can. I can actually use an example from this morning when I was making breakfast for my 7-year-old daughter. So she loves noodles, ramen. She loves making the broth herself. Her 10-year-old sister has cottoned on to this idea of making broth herself, but because she likes the broth that my 7-year-old makes, she tried to copy what my 7-year-old was doing with her broth. And so what my 7-year-old did was she hid all the ingredients that you would need to make a secret broth, so my 10-year-old wouldn't have access to that. And so I came out of the bedroom this morning bleary-eyed to a conflict happening in the kitchen. And so my 10-year-old says to me, Harper's, hiding all the ingredients. I can't make the broth. And then, I wasn't very empathic with my 7-year-old. And so my voice was a bit raised. And I said, why are you hiding? Why? And then I had to catch myself. Actually, my wife caught me. She said, actually, Davin, can you, just take a step back. And actually, my wife is very good at doing that. So instead of trying to enforce the rule of law onto my 7-year-old, and say things like, "Oh God, you're so mean," or you you're selfish, all these kinds of things that are in the back of my head that kind of wanted to say, but I caught myself and I had to breathe and be mindful and actually remember the practice of empathic discipline. By the way, clinicians are the worst at following their own advice, but this time I'm going to take the win. So this time I actually remembered those concepts, that triangle thing I was telling you about and the magnet analogy I was using. So I sunk down so I got down to a level and there was no magic at all. It was purely just trying to understand where she was coming from. So the story was my 7-year-old, she just said, this is my soup, my creation. She was really worried that a 10-year-old sister would make soup that was much nicer than hers. And so she felt threatened, and that's why she hid all the ingredients. And so anyway, cut a long story short, I didn't have any clever solutions at all. I had no idea where this was going. But as soon as I started reflecting some of those feelings back to her, are you worried that, your sister's going to make soup that might taste nicer? I was using her words. And then she just relaxed completely. And then she just, like magic, just said, oh, okay, here are the ingredients. And that was amazing. I thought it was incredible. And I'm pleased that happened because I can give you this anecdote this morning because I was struggling to think about what kinds of situations to talk about. So this is great.
Today's episode was brought to you by Grand Huron International, an on-demand coaching provider for individuals and companies. You mentioned anxiety, that you've got a lot of children that you have as patients, and then parents who are parents to those anxious children or teachers to those anxious children. Let's talk about anxiety for a second, because the students that I get are undergraduates. They're 19 to 23 years old. And I've been teaching for more than a decade now, let's say 12 years or 13 years. And I've seen a steady increase of anxiety. The number of anxious students has grown, and the degree of anxiety has also increased.
Yeah.
And I just wonder whether or not you could speak a little bit to any parents that are listening about how they might want to go about helping their anxious child. What are some things that you'd like to share?
Yeah. So I suppose the first thing is, we don't have any prescribed ways of. I don't think we should have any prescribed ways of dealing with anxiety because it manifests in such a different way depending on the individual. So I think this concept of being able to empathize with a child is actually, I think that should be our base. I think that should be our starting point. Actually, I correct myself before we even do that. Like you've pointed out before a couple of times, being self-aware, slowing down. Because as parents, we don't want our kids to hurt. We want to take away their pain. And it's easy for us to feel caught up in the anxiety of not being able to help as well. Anxiety can be a bit mysterious, and we want to solve the anxiety, the pain for our kids. And some of us can get overly reactive. And so I think slowing down, empathizing with the child, truly trying to understand the experience of what they're going through. I think it sounds a little bit, we use the word naff in New Zealand. I think maybe that might mean contrite or contrived. This idea of truly understanding someone, the power of that is immense, I think, because anxiety, I think, comes from a place of obviously this uncertainty about the world around them, uncertainty about the future, uncertainty of whether you have the skills to cope with a demand. And that generates a lot of fear and a sense of threat in the person experiencing anxiety. So if you as an adult, as a parent, can be that constant, the person that your child can connect with and know that they're safe, and there's a certainty of safety and security, and that happens through being able to understand and link in and jam with your young person, truly know what their experience is. I think that that's so powerful in taking the wind out of the sails of that experience of anxiety. And then once you can do that, then I think that's when you can start to collaborate on whatever is the problem that is generating that anxiety. Sometimes problems won't be obvious, and sometimes it's a bit of a work in progress. Sometimes it takes numerous conversations before one can define a problem well enough to then solve it. But in order to get the definition correct, you have to understand what the problem is, and we won't be able to understand what the problem is if we're not able to empathize with the young person, because we're flapping around, reacting, and not slowing down and
is that mindful. Is that sort of part of what you mean when you think we all benefit by connecting with each other's stories? Is that part of what you mean?
Yes, I think it is. I think so. Yes. It's amazing when you feel as though someone else has understood your story. You can really kind of join you in your story. You feel like you're not so alone. Yes.
Yeah, I'm thinking less about my child right now, and I'm thinking more about my husband right now, that he is such a good listener that I always feel safe and understood, and I don't feel I return the favor to the same degree, and I wish I did, and I could do so much more. So much of what you said to me has resonated as tonight I want to be an especially good listener and be especially self-aware and especially empathic. So thank you for that. Go ahead.
Welcome.
Sorry.
You're welcome. And as I'm talking to you and listening to you, I'm also thinking, oh my goodness, I'm such a hypocrite. I need to do that too with my loved ones. Isn't it terrible?
Yeah, that's why we have to turn to Kristen Neff's work on self-compassion too, right? As we're talking about
yes.
this. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, because it's hard. It's hard to be a parent. It's hard to be a good friend. It's hard to be a daughter. It's hard to be all of that. Yeah. So what are the traits of rational empathy? What do you mean by that? Of a rational empath? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think what I've observed in a number of my empathic patients, my empaths, is that they have common characteristics. For example, they give more than they consume. Their senses are highly attuned to their environment. And they can tend to burn out more easily than people who are less empathic than they are. And sometimes they talk about, so my depressed empaths, they'll talk about being able to extrovert when they need to, but then they crash completely, the next day when they've had a social event that they felt like they've been forced into. And so I suppose I coined this term how do you be a more rational empath? And rational is maybe it's a funny term because humans aren't always rational anyway. Maybe it's an aspirational thing, but I think there's certain things that my empaths can do to look after themselves, because I think, you know, empaths are notoriously bad at not looking after themselves. They look after everyone else, but you know, they struggle to look after themselves. So I think so I coined that term rational empaths to use in my clinic, so I could orientate my patients to this idea that, okay, hey, you know, you're an empathic person. You give more than you consume. So make sure you guard your heart. You're more sensitive than maybe others around you. And, you know, so make sure you have time for yourself to surround yourself in natural surroundings. There's this Japanese idea called forest bathing, which I'm not sure if you... Yes.
Shirin-yoku.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, you pronounce that very well. And I think some of my empaths really love that idea. You know, just sitting in one of our bushes in New Zealand and just kind of tuning the world out, and then this idea of extroverting but then crashing afterwards. So some of my empaths don't always realize that they're stuck in this boom and bust pattern of interacting with people. And so I think this idea of being rational about your empathy, like, hey, let's save some of your energy for later. You know, you're entitled to save some of that energy so that you can keep giving. And and I think they tend to hear more than they speak, which means sometimes they can forget themselves, because they're so locked into the interaction with another, and they're sort of fully present in someone else's story that they've almost forgotten their own story. And I think for some of my patients who are empaths and have been struggling with depression, they feel very guilty about paying attention to their own story, you know, because they might not feel that they're good enough, or that, you know, their story doesn't measure up to someone else's. And so they spend time in other people's stories. And then when they do that, they imagine that their story is, you know, less and less and less and less important. So anyway, in clinic, I'll talk about, think about, you know, being a bit more rational with our empathy. You know, your story is important too. Anyway, so it's just a term that I've used to kind of talk about some of these things with my empaths, if that makes any sense.
Totally. So Davin, I've gotten into the habit of asking all my guests at the end of our conversation to share, if they would, a story of a time when you were on the receiving end of empathy, or what I call purposeful empathy, where you really feel like somebody was empathizing with you and was really, you know, doing it on purpose, you know, knew you needed a dose of empathy, and what that meant for you.
Yeah. So I love this question because I tell my patients and my colleagues about it all the time. And it goes back to my medical school days. So as a medical student, we have what we call the clinical years. And in the clinical years, you run through different rotations, different specialties. And one specialty that really stuck out for me was pediatrics. And I remember working on a pediatric emergency department as a student. And I had this elderly. He might not have been that elderly, but in my mind he was elderly and wise. He was an old professor of pediatrics, and you know, he was the boss for one shift, and so all the training pediatricians would consult with him, you know, when they had questions about what was going on in the emergency department with their patients. And some of them were very burnt out doctors, and had very little empathy for the patients that would come through the door. Anyway, so this old professor came to me, and little did he know at the time I was really struggling myself with being a medical student. I felt that I was not good enough. And I was, I was going to fail. I was very anxious. And there was other things going on in my personal life. It was pretty much just a chaotic time for me. But he told me two things. He said to me, oh, what's your name? Davin. He said, oh, my name's, Rod. And he sort of introduced himself on a first name basis. And he said, oh, I'm a doctor, and let me know if I can help you. Little did I know that he is like this professor of pediatrics who's very erudite and well respected, but he sort of came down to my level and kind of saw, here's this struggling medical student that has no idea what's going on. And then he told me, so he just kind of talked to me and asked me a little bit about, my my journey. And he said, oh man, yeah, I forget how hard medical school is, and you can do it. And he didn't say anything clever, but it was more so what I felt. I felt the sense of being looked after. And I found out later who he was, and then thought, oh my goodness, this is a guy who's very well respected and came down to my level. And I thought, man, that's awesome. I think it just gave me the motivation to keep going. But the other thing he told me was that, Davin, if a mother comes to you and tells you that there's something wrong with their child, they're not quite right. 9 times out of 10, she'll be right. And 9 times out of 10, you'll be wrong. So make sure that you always listen to your patients. And I never forgot that. So those two experiences kind of, I think they coalesced, and I'm going off track now, but he was obviously a very empathic person, because I felt and remember the feeling of that experience rather than what he said. And that gave me the motivation to just keep going in my training. And that's partly why I became a psychiatrist, because I wanted to spend time with people. I wanted to hear their stories. I wanted to join with them. I wanted to be where people are. I wanted to to remember that I'm not the only person on earth that has a story, and everyone else has a story, and everyone's story is valid. So that experience taught me a lot.
Oh, I love that story. Thank you for sharing it. It sounds like he was jamming with you. And yes. Yeah, and I really love that piece of advice that he gave you, because I really think most parents who come into a doctor's office, or most patients who come into a doctor's office, they know their bodies, they know themselves.
Yes.
Davin, I can't thank you enough for this really lovely conversation. I've taken so much away from it, but I've also found myself noticing how much I appreciate how different your cadence is from mine, and that you aren't in a rush to say something, as I always feel like I'm, trying to rush through the words, and that I could slow down with my speaking. So I just want to just appreciate that about you, in addition to the content that we've shared. But I also really like the speed at which things unfold as your thoughts unfold. So thank you for that.
Oh, you're welcome. I think the feeling is mutual. It's funny how conversations flow sometimes, when I think you're obviously quite a creative person and self-aware, because I don't think you would say that unless you were cognizant of what was happening in the interaction. I fail to do that sometimes, where I don't notice my cadence. But if I'm thinking about it, I think you're right. Like when we are truly self-aware, we can almost adjust ourselves so that it suits the rhythm of the conversation. And I feel that's been happening this morning, and I really, really appreciate as well the opportunity to talk with you and learn from you. And it's also helped me, even just you asking those questions. It's sort of triggered cascades of thought in my mind. How can I improve how I be with other people? And also thank you for that trip down memory lane, because, I think about that professor intermittently, but it's reminded me of that story. So thank you. And I hope it helps your listeners.
With that, well, why don't we ask them? Put your comments or questions in the comment box. Let us know, based on what you've heard today, what you're going to do differently, what insights you've had, what aha moments. We'd love to hear from you. And with that, I'll just say thanks again, and thank you for watching. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week at Purposeful Empathy. What if you had access to your own council of coaches to help you break free of your thinking clutter, make that important decision, and liberate you from whatever is holding you back? At Grand Huron International, you get to choose the coach of your choice anytime from anywhere. Visit grandhuroninternational.ca and harness the power of on-demand coaching today.